was a short report released on TMDX from Scorpion Reports, and I really just want to go through just a few things I noticed quickly. The short report in itself is 300 pages, which is just too long to go through the whole thing. You can go through yourself. In general, I actually find this report very hard to read because the entire structure is, big words at the top and then I guess proof of evidence below. So really this needed to be condensed down and cleaned up quite a bit, but I guess originally this was effective. The stock price was down 15% in the morning. As of now, I think it's down, probably like 5%. It's been rebounding quite nicely. Yeah, 6.5%. So the first thing I'm going to start with is I actually don't own this company, and I actually want to share why. And this short report does a really good job of just basically highlighting it. It's this comment in their Q3 earnings call: "There's no shift in gears. It's your perception of reality." And I started seeing this pop up on Twitter a lot. And one of the first things I always go do is I like to go read earnings calls just to get a quick idea of the business. And before this was even highlighted in this report, it's been highlighted by like other people. Before I even saw that, it stuck out to me as well. It's just a really inappropriate thing for a CEO to ever be saying to an earnings analyst. And in general, whenever you have a CEO of a company, even if they're internally like not cool-headed, publicly in a 1 hour earnings call, they should be doing their best to basically keep their head. So this was definitely a red flag for me. Another red flag about this business is this: they have 2.8 stars on Glassdoor, and 40% of people approve of the CEO. So when I'm already looking at a business, I don't really know a lot about organ transplant. One of the first things I'm looking at is like, can I even see the company's well run? Do I trust the CEO? Because stuff like that might be enough for me to go deeper. And when I saw stuff like this pretty quickly, I was just already disinterested and outside of the business. The other thing that's just kind of obvious to me is like, I'm always very like wary of healthcare businesses because they typically take advantage of insurance companies. And I'm also just like wary of like, what is really the ceiling for a business like this? There aren't that many people who get, transplants on an annual basis. And a lot of times with most medical companies, this long-term success of your business is basically on patenting, right, on your patents. Now, with that being said, that doesn't mean the short report is legitimate. That doesn't mean there aren't things that I want to kind of point out here that I noticed. So one of the big things I noticed is it contradicts itself a lot in the short report. So it talks about how this device doesn't do anything and it's not very useful. But then at the same time, it talks about how they are strong-arming people into using their device, which is just a little bit confusing to me. So if you don't know, TMDX offers lung transplant, heart transplant, and liver transplant, okay? And the typical way you transplant these products is by putting them on ice, and then you fly it from point A to point B. Now, the downside to this strategy is the organ doesn't last very long, okay? And I also think it increases the risk that it, sustains damage. So TMDX uses this thing called perfusion, where basically they keep the organ functioning as if it were inside of a body, which means the viability of the organ is much longer. Okay, so instead of it being like 4 or 6 hours, for example, for something like a heart, it'll be more like 12. And that's actually a big deal because that means you can transplant the organ farther and you can take more time doing the transplant. People assume that doctors are perfect, they don't make mistakes, and it's like doctors are human, right? So just like any human, when they're under pressure or under tired, they're susceptible to making mistakes. So like something this short report points out is like doctors want to use this so they can get their beauty sleep. And it's like, or doctors want to use this so they can be functioning at their best ability, right? And they can make sure they can do the best job possible. So there is a value proposition here. Having more time for an organ to be around and to not die is like legitimately a valuable thing. So like that's one of the first things I just want to point out. The other thing I want to point out is it talks about people are strong arm or they're forced to use this product, and that's just obviously not true. When it comes to using an organ transplant, a company does not own the organ, right? The transplanting company. So these hospitals are hiring TMDX to do the organ transplant for them, right? Or like to bring the organ to transport the organ for transplant, right? Too many trans here. From point A to point B. So if they did not like their service or their cost or their business, they don't have to use TMDX, right? So like already half of this is just done, right? Like it's just obviously not true. So that's one of the first things I'm going to point out. The second thing I'm going to point out is like there's a lot of alleged like fraud or kickbacks, this kind of, racketeering, right? We can see here like large scale fraud in a bill, blah, blah, blah. And it's not very well proved because you basically have people on the phone. We don't know who these people are, right? We don't know, if these people have a conflict of interest. Like, for example, they could be interviewing someone who's a competitor who's also a doctor who does organ transplants. who's clearly going to say bad things about a competitor, right? So whenever you have like so-and-so saying this, just remember we have no idea who's saying this, right? It's actually not that meaningful for someone who's basically saying it's anonymous. This would be a lot more powerful if you had a bunch of doctors, like 100 doctors, send out a signed letter about how this is true and put their name on it and post it in public, because then you're like risking libel if you're not telling the truth. So like that's just something that's always aware to me whenever I'm looking at these short reports. Competition and if they'll be replaced. So NRP, I looked into this very briefly, and basically what happens is a patient dies and then you pump their blood anyway to keep the organ alive. So if you want to literally transport an organ using NRP, you have to transport the body, right? And the reason why this is probably illegal in Europe and not the United States is we just view like this is much more like something I could see succeeding in a more like left-leaning society. There's a lot of people who don't want their body transported and taken apart, really. And like generally, like I can understand the ethical concerns here. And the other issue here is you have to transport every organ in the body from point A to point B. So you cannot, usually when you're taking organs, they're going to like 4 or 5 different places, right? They're going to a bunch of different hospitals. So there's like a clear downside to here. In terms of competitive tsunami, I wouldn't doubt this at all, right? And it's entirely possible that this is affecting, TMDX's revenue and their earnings. This is something we'll see play out in time. As I said, I'm not an expert on this stuff, so I have no idea. I have no idea if they have a significant edge or if they don't. I do think that their planes is actually a competitive advantage, despite how it's construed in this article. Yes, you can hire a private plane, but isn't it better to have somebody who knows exactly where their planes are, who know how to get their plane from point A to point B, who have like pilots on call, like whoever they need at all times? Like a normal private pilot, yes, they probably fly organs and stuff time to time, but this is not something that they're experienced in. The point of most private pilot businesses is not to get organs from point A to point B, it's to get the people. So like what I'm basically saying is I think this is a much larger logistical challenge than people appreciate, and having a dedicated fleet to that makes sense to me. In terms of this being at risk at recall, etc., this to me is like maybe, but this has been FDA approved for like 6 years. It's very hard to get something FDA approved. When you look at transporting organs, you're never going to have a 100% success rate. Like organ transplants are really, really challenging. The transport and the transplant are very challenging. So it does not surprise me that 5 or 10% of organs just are not viable when you transport them to me. And then it doesn't surprise me that a certain percent of the patients just reject the organs and die. Like you're taking someone else's organ from point A to point B. I don't think people will realize just how hacky medication and medicine is. So again, like this is just kind of a nothing statement to me. Outside of that, in terms of this business, like it said, it's not something I'd own. I don't find this short report like that compelling, but as I mentioned in the beginning, like there are clear bearish signs of the company for me to basically not be an investor. But I think if you feel pretty well versed on this and you're pretty knowledgeable, I honestly think you're okay to just kind of hold and see how this develops if you know it's kind of like a high risk, high reward proposition. So yeah, that's it.